The passengers were just settling into their seats, the usual hum of conversation filling the cabin, when an uncomfortable scene began to unfold. An elderly woman, her hands slightly trembling, made her way down the narrow aisle, her eyes scanning for her seat. She moved carefully, mindful of the passengers already seated, but the moment she reached her row, a sigh of irritation cut through the air. A young flight attendant stood nearby, arms crossed, tapping her foot impatiently. "Ma'am, you need to hurry up. We have a schedule to keep," she said, her tone sharp enough to turn a few heads. The old woman, flustered, fumbled with her small bag, her face flushing with embarrassment. "I'm sorry, dear. I just need a moment," she whispered. The attendant rolled her eyes. "A moment? We don't have all day. Maybe flying isn't for you if you can't keep up," she muttered under her breath, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. A few exchanged uneasy glances, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats. No one wanted to get involved, but the tension was undeniable. The elderly woman's face fell. She had traveled many times before, but never had she been treated like this. With an almost invisible nod of resignation, she took her seat quietly, her eyes fixed on the window as if trying to disappear. As the flight continued, the attendant carried on as if nothing had happened, offering cheerful service to other passengers. But something about her behavior had left a bitter taste in the air. Whispers spread through the cabin, and one man sitting a few rows away couldn't shake off what he had witnessed. He observed the flight attendant closely, a knowing glint in his eyes, as if he was waiting for the right moment. What no one knew, not even the flight attendant, was that by the time the plane landed, she would be in for the biggest shock of her life. Something was about to happen that would change everything. As the plane cruised through the sky, the atmosphere remained tense. The elderly woman sat quietly by the window, her hands folded in her lap. Every now and then, she let out a small sigh, as if trying to keep herself composed. A few passengers glanced her way, their faces showing sympathy, but no one spoke up. The flight attendant, now back to her usual routine, moved down the aisle with a forced smile, handing out drinks and snacks as if nothing had happened. The man who had been watching everything closely leaned back in his seat, arms crossed. He was in his late 40s, dressed in a crisp suit, with an air of quiet authority. He had witnessed many things in his life, but what had just happened didn't sit right with him. The way the flight attendant had humiliated the old woman, without a hint of remorse, stuck in his mind. The old woman, unaware of the attention she had drawn, gently reached into her purse, pulling out a faded photograph. She traced her fingers over the edges, her eyes softening as she gazed at the image. Whatever memory it held, it seemed to bring her some comfort, but just as quickly she tucked it away, as if afraid someone might see. Meanwhile, the flight attendant took a quick break near the galley, chatting with another crew member. "Ah, some passengers are just so slow," she whispered, shaking her head. "I swear, they hold up everything." Her colleague shot her a look, but didn't respond. Instead, she handed her a tray and walked off, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation. Back in the cabin, the man in the suit checked his watch. His eyes flickered toward the old woman, then back at the flight attendant, as if piecing something together. He took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. The landing announcement came over the speakers. The plane would be touching down soon. The flight attendant had no idea that her actions had not gone unnoticed, and she certainly wasn't prepared for what was waiting for her after they landed. As the plane began its descent, the tension in the cabin remained. The elderly woman sat motionless, her hands gently clasped together, as if bracing for the landing. A few passengers glanced her way, their expressions unreadable, but she didn't seem to notice. Her mind was elsewhere. The flight attendant, oblivious to the quiet glances being exchanged around her, went about her final duties, checking seat belts and securing the cabin. She flashed a bright, almost practiced smile at some passengers, but when her eyes flickered toward the old woman, there was nothing but indifference. To her, the moment had already passed, forgotten. But for others, it hadn't. The man in the suit, who had been watching everything unfold, leaned slightly forward in his seat. His gaze flickered between the flight attendant and the old woman, his expression unreadable. There was something about the elderly passenger that held his attention, something beyond just the way she had been treated. He tapped his fingers lightly against the armrest, deep in thought. A few rows behind him, a young woman had also witnessed the scene earlier. She had wanted to say something, to stand up for the older woman, but fear held her back. What if a flight attendant lashed out at her too? What if it just made things worse? Now, as the landing approached, regret gnawed at her. She stole a glance at the man in the suit, wondering if he was thinking the same thing. The old woman, still staring out the window, took a deep breath as if steadying herself. There was sadness in her eyes, but there was also something else, something quiet but powerful. As the plane finally touched down, a hushed anticipation settled over those who had been paying attention. The flight attendant, standing near the front, smoothed down her uniform and prepared to disembark as if nothing had happened. But something had happened, and soon she was going to find out just how much. As the plane rolled to a stop at the gate, the usual rustling of seatbelts unclicking and overhead bins opening filled the cabin. But for some passengers, there was an unspoken tension in the air. The flight attendant, standing near the exit, adjusted her uniform with a satisfied expression, ready to greet passengers as they disembarked. She had no idea that eyes were still on her, watching, waiting. The elderly woman remained seated, making no rush to gather her belongings. Her fingers tapped lightly against the armrest, a slow, thoughtful rhythm. The man in the suit observed her closely, his expression unreadable. It was as if he knew something that no one else did. A few rows back, the young woman who had witnessed the earlier exchange hesitated before standing. She glanced toward the old woman, then at the flight attendant, debating whether to say something. But before she could decide, movement near the front of the plane caught her attention. The pilot had stepped out of the cockpit, speaking in low tones with another crew member. The moment his gaze landed on the elderly woman, his expression shifted. He walked toward her with purpose, his footsteps firm against the cabin floor. The flight attendant, still smiling at departing passengers, noticed him approaching but paid little attention until he stopped right in front of the old woman's seat. "Ma'am," the pilot said, his voice filled with something close to reverence, "it's an honor to have you on board today." The flight attendant blinked, confused. She glanced between the pilot and the elderly woman, struggling to understand what was happening. The passengers nearby had begun to take notice, their curiosity piqued. The old woman looked up at the pilot, her eyes warm but steady. "Thank you, dear," she said softly, offering him a small nod. The flight attendant's smile faltered slightly. "Wait," she said, forcing out a chuckle. "Who is she?" The pilot turned to look at her, his expression unreadable. "You don't know?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. The flight attendant felt a strange chill creep up her spine. Something was happening, something she wasn't prepared for. The flight attendant's heart pounded as the pilot's words hung in the air. She forced a smile, but the growing tension in the cabin made it harder to ignore the sudden shift in atmosphere. Passengers who had been gathering their bags now lingered, sensing that something was happening. A few exchanged glances, waiting for an answer to the question that had just been asked. The old woman remained composed, her eyes never leaving the pilot's. There was no arrogance in her expression, no need to explain herself. She simply waited. The pilot finally turned back to the flight attendant. "This woman," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "is one of the most respected figures in aviation history." A hush fell over the immediate rows. The flight attendant's face paled slightly. She let out a small, nervous laugh. "That can't be right," she said quickly. "I mean, she's just—" Her voice trailed off as the old woman finally stood, adjusting the scarf around her neck with a quiet dignity. The man in the suit, who had been watching the entire time, finally spoke. "I thought I recognized you," he said, his voice carrying across the stunned silence. You're Eleanor Carter, aren't you? The name sent a ripple through the air. A few passengers gasped. Even the young woman who had debated speaking up earlier suddenly looked at the elderly woman with wide eyes. The name meant something. The flight attendant felt her stomach tighten. She didn't recognize the name, but the reactions around her told her everything she needed to know. Who is she? She asked, her voice quieter now. The pilot exhaled slowly, as if trying to process that someone in his crew didn't know. Eleanor Carter was one of the first female commercial pilots in the country, he said. She paved the way for women in aviation, trained countless pilots, broke records, and changed the industry forever. She's a legend. The flight attendant's throat tightened. The way she had treated this woman, without a second thought, with impatience and condescension, it suddenly felt heavier. But before she could speak, Eleanor finally turned to face her directly, and the look in her eyes made it clear. This wasn't over yet. The cabin was completely still. The flight attendant could feel the weight of every eye on her, the realization sinking in like a cold wave. She'd had treated this woman, the Eleanor Carter, like she was nothing. And now, standing face to face with her, she struggled to find words. Eleanor held her gaze, calm but unshaken. "You never know who you're speaking to, dear," she said softly, her voice carrying the wisdom of years. "Respect should never depend on status." The flight attendant swallowed hard. A lump had formed in her throat, but she forced herself to smile. I didn't mean anything by it," she stammered. "I was just trying to do my job." Eleanor gave a small nod, but something in her eyes said she had heard that excuse before. The pilot cleared his throat. "Miss Carter, I would love to personally escort you to the terminal," he said. "It would be an honor." The flight attendant's stomach churned. She could feel her co-worker's stares, the shift in energy unmistakable. Just moments ago, she had been in control, the authority in the cabin. Now, she felt like a passenger on a plane spiraling downward. As Eleanor gathered her things, the man in the suit stepped forward. "I was actually on one of your flights as a child," he said, offering her a warm smile. "You inspired me to become a pilot." Eleanor studied him for a moment, then smiled. "Then I suppose I did something right," she said with a chuckle. The passengers who had witnessed everything now looked at the flight attendant, their expressions expectant. It was clear they were waiting for something, for her to acknowledge what she had done. Taking a shaky breath, she turned to Eleanor. I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wasn't fair to you." Eleanor nodded, but instead of responding, she simply patted the flight attendant's arm. "Remember this moment," she said gently. "It's never too late to learn." As Eleanor walked off the plane, escorted by the pilot and a few admiring passengers, the flight attendant stood frozen. But just as she exhaled, relieved the moment had passed, a voice crackled over the intercom. "Attention all passengers, we have a special announcement." The flight attendant's blood ran cold. She wasn't out of turbulence yet. The flight attendant stood frozen as the intercom crackled again. "Ladies and gentlemen, before you disembark, we'd like to take a moment to recognize a very special guest on board today. Eleanor Carter, a pioneer in aviation and one of the first female commercial pilots, was with us on this flight. We are honored to have had her travel with us." A round of applause spread through the cabin, some passengers even standing to show their respect. The flight attendant's face burned. She wanted to disappear, to take back every dismissive word she had spoken earlier. She had treated Eleanor as just another passenger, unaware that she was in the presence of someone who had changed the very industry she worked in. Eleanor, now standing just outside the cockpit, gave a humble smile and a small wave to those who clapped for her. She didn't bask in the attention, she simply acknowledged it with quiet grace. The man in the suit turned toward the flight attendant one last time. "People always reveal who they are when they think no one important is watching," he said, his voice calm but pointed. "But the truth is, everyone is important." The words hit her harder than she expected. As the last of the passengers exited, she let out a slow breath, the weight of the moment settling in. She had spent years in customer service, thinking she had seen it all, but today was different. Today, she had learned something that wouldn't leave her anytime soon. As she gathered her things, preparing for the next flight, she glanced toward the jet bridge where Eleanor was being warmly greeted by airport staff. For a brief second, their eyes met again. Elena gave her a small, knowing smile before walking away. The flight attendant didn't know if she would ever see her again, but she knew one thing for certain: she would never make the same mistake twice. From now on, she would treat every passenger with the same respect, no matter who they were.